I'm Anthony of Revolutionary Jam, and it's May the 27th, 2008. My MP Tom Harris is holding an annual meeting this evening for his constituents, and I'll be attending to question him on his voting record. Tom Harris is the Labour Member of Parliament for Glasgow South, my constituency, and he's Parliamentary Under-Secretary at the Department for Transport. Now, I first had a look at his voting record several months ago on theyworkforyou.com, which I'll put a link to in the sidebar, and I was very underimpressed with what I saw. He's voted very strongly against a transparent parliament, very strongly in favour of introducing ID cards, very strongly for stringent anti-terrorist laws, including detention without trial, which I consider to be a severe breach of our civil liberties. Not only did he vote very strongly for the war in Iraq, he's also voted very strongly against investigating the war, despite the wealth of evidence that the public was manipulated. And finally, he's voted very strongly in favour of a new generation of nuclear weapons, which may cost taxpayers upwards of £25 billion. I want to ask Mr Harris, as a Labour man, how he can justify so closely following this blatantly neoconservative agenda. I've been in touch with Mr Harris before regarding the latest EU reform treaty, now known as the Lisbon Treaty. I asked him not to vote in favour of it because, according to many, the document was some 99% similar to the EU constitution, which was vetoed, but which his party promised the British public a referendum on. Tom Harris decided to wait for a matter of weeks till after he'd already voted against giving the public a referendum on the matter to get back to me with a detailed response. I'm guessing because he wouldn't have liked me to debunk the information that he provided me with in his email, which I gather was a pretty standard set the party members were given to email out critics of the treaty. If I'm able to ask a second question, I'd like to ask Tom if he's aware that in ratifying this and the previous EU treaties, he and the rest of the Parliament are guilty of two crimes. Firstly, conspiracy to subvert the Constitution, sedition at common law, and secondly, conspiracy to hand this nation to a foreign power, treason at common law. Please check the sidebar for some links to videos and articles on just how bad the Lisbon Treaty really is, and indeed the whole EU institution now. I'll be continuing this video when I get back from the meeting. So I got back from the meeting a couple of days ago. Unfortunately, under 30 people turned up, but that was okay because it meant the atmosphere was intimate and everyone who wanted to got to ask a couple of questions. Tom Harris was much as I expected. Seems like a reasonably nice fellow, but his politics are terrible. I mean, he barely gave an answer that I agreed with, and I think, you know, most people there felt the same. Various people brought up economic issues, and I had my 2 cents. I don't know, you might have seen in some of my other videos, I know a fair bit about economics, and the thing is, a lot of that seemed to go past people, which I think is reasonable enough. He kept on insisting that inflation is at 3%, which is the government's figure, but anyone who's been to the supermarket recently knows that food inflation far surpasses that. And I mentioned that I think that was partly to do with the Bank of England cutting interest rates, and gave a proper explanation of that. He said that those of us with mortgages, you know, I don't think we ever complain when the Bank of England cuts interest rates. Well, that's natural when people aren't educated to know what the other effects of that are. I also brought up the fact that banks are allowed to lend 9 times as much money as you lend with them, but he never really responded to that. He said that when Labour took power, they gave Bank of England the ability to set interest rates because they didn't think that it was a good idea to allow the Chancellor of a government to do it. Now, personally, I don't think anyone should be doing that, and I said that. I said I think it should be left to market forces, but I never addressed it. Anyway, enough on that, because I'd really like to get onto the issues that I broached in the introduction to the video. Well, someone else brought up the Lisbon Treaty, and he said that he didn't think it was the same as the EU constitution, although he accepts that some people say it is the same. But he said that he wouldn't have even supported a referendum on the original EU constitution because he thought that the media would spin it this way, that way and the other, and it would just end up being a debate over whether people like French people or not, or whether people want the EU to regulate the size of bananas or any made-up story. Now, I don't think that gives the British people much credit, but apart from anything else, the main argument that got to me was when he said that a lot of the critics were criticising powers that the EU already has, such as the fact that EU legislation overwrites British legislation. Now, I think that's a good criticism because each country should be able to make its own laws. I don't know what you think, but I don't think our laws should be overruled by Europe. The fact is, it was his lack of attitude that would show that he thought that was an issue. I mean, I thought that was an issue. I think the other people in the room who were interested in those issues thought that was an issue. And just because the EU's always had that power doesn't mean that it always should have that power. Also, someone else brought up expenses, and I don't know if all of you know, but there's been a bit of a furore in the media recently about government employees and their expenses, and because someone else brought that up, I mentioned that he'd voted against a transparent parliament. He went on to say that the reason for that is not that he has a problem with his constituents knowing his expenses, but he thinks that the media is likely to get hold of this, that and the other and spin things out of proportion and get people into rabble over things which are misconstrued. So, not for a transparent parliament. For those reasons, make what you will. On his voting record, I mentioned the list that I showed you at the beginning of this video, and the two topics out of that list, ignoring the war and such, that he chose to pick up on were ID cards and detainment without trial. With a view to detainment without trial, he actually said that he was asked why he stood for 42 days detainment without trial and gave the response, because I couldn't get 90 days. He said that his opinion was that the duty of the government was to protect the people, and if that took 90 days detainment without trial, then fine. Now, I don't know what you think, but I think that if you were held for 90 or even 42 days without trial, not allowed to access to a lawyer, maybe not even know what the charges brought against you were, and a certain amount of pressure was exerted upon you, you might just as well confess to anything. So I don't think that that's a good idea, especially considering history. Google the Guilford Four if you've not heard about them, and there's other incidences of things like that which went on where people were arrested for crimes they didn't commit. And for ID cards, he actually says basically ID cards are happening whether you like them or not. Even if ID cards weren't happening, you'd have to get a new passport soon and within 10 years, and the new passports will be biometric, etc, etc. Now, the difference is I'm not obliged legally to carry my passport, and I cannot be fined for not carrying my passport. So, I'm really dismayed at his view that this government control is for our own safety. I think it's naive. I don't know what world he wants his children to live in. Hitler used the census to find out who had Jewish ancestors. And this goes on. That's mostly the subjects I can think about of mentioning in the video, but if you've got any other questions, by all means leave a comment and we'll discuss it further. Thanks very much for watching. Take care.